Okay, to begin our discussion of the supply curve, we start by talking about quantity supplied for a commodity, which we abbreviate in this lecture as QS. And the quantity supplied for a commodity can be thought of as being the function of several other variables. The price of the commodity, expectations for the future, cost of production, lots of other stuff. To begin, we're going to just focus on the relationship between prices and quantity supply, okay? And the way that we do this at the start is we construct a supply schedule. And the supply schedule, as you see here, will have one column for the price per unit of a commodity, in this case the daily quantity supplied of oil, measured in barrels. And as the price per unit rises from $10 a barrel to $30 a barrel to $60 a barrel, we see that that sellers' willingness to supply, their quantity supplied, also rises. And we label each one of these price-quantity combinations with a letter. Now, there are two ways to interpret what the supply schedule is actually telling you. One way is to start with price, so for instance $10 a barrel, and solve for the maximum quantity that the market is willing to supply at that price. So at $10 a barrel, the maximum quantity that sellers are willing to supply is 20 barrels. At $60 a barrel, the maximum quantity supplied is 120 barrels. Another way of interpreting what the supply schedule tells you is you start with quantity supplied and solve for price. And the way that you should interpret this perspective is, starting with the first row here, okay, what is the minimum price that sellers are willing to accept in order to sell the 20th barrel of oil? $10. What is the minimum price that sellers are willing to accept in order to supply the 60th barrel of oil? $30. And if you think about it, what that minimum price that sellers are willing to accept can be interpreted as is just really the economic cost of production. Oftentimes we refer to this as the reservation price for sellers. If it costs $20 to make that 40th barrel of oil, well then it makes a lot of sense that sellers would not sell it for less than $20. Now, typically we're not going to actually use supply schedules. We're going to revert to supply curves. So here I've got an example where I just kind of show point B and point D. We can use those exact same two interpretations. So the horizontal perspective starts at price and solves for the maximum quantity supplied. So at a price of $40 a barrel, the maximum quantity supplied is 80 barrels. Or we can take a vertical perspective and get that other interpretation solves for the reservation price for a seller, i.e. the economic cost of production. So what is the cost of producing that 80th barrel, i.e. what is the minimum price that sellers are willing to accept to sell that 80th barrel? It is $40 a barrel. Now, the fact that we have this nice upward sloping supply curve, the upward sloping nature of the supply curve indicates that typically, and we call this the law of supply, when price increases, quantity supply will also increase. So if price goes from 20 to 40, we see that quantity supply rises from 40 to 80. And conversely, if price were to fall from 40 to, say, 20, then we can expect quantity supply to decline, in this example, from 80 to 40. That positive relationship between price and quantity supplied is oftentimes referred to as the law of supply. Why the law of supply? Well, remember that what the height of the supply curve is measuring is the economic cost of producing a particular quantity of output, a particular barrel, in this case, the Qth unit. So the fact that the supply curve is upward sloping indicates that some barrels, okay, those down, have lower cost of production relative to those later barrels. Okay, so one way of viewing what the supply curve's upward slope tells us is that low-cost producers, okay, low-cost barrels are down here somewhere, and high-cost barrels are up here somewhere. At any given price, let's say P, okay, quantity supplied is Q, because it's only these sellers who actually have a cost below the price. Okay, so these are other sellers who are actually willing to sell their oil in the marketplace because their minimum price they're willing to accept falls below the actual market price. So in this example here, at a price of P, we have Q sellers all along this dark red portion of the supply curve who have an economic cost below or at P. And then for all the sellers up here who have an economic cost above P, well, they're not going to sell this commodity because the price is below the cost of production. So now, that said, the law of supply exists because when the price rises, in this example, from P up to, say, P prime, so we see an increase in the quantity supplied. As price increases, it gradually rises above more and more sellers' minimum willingness to accept. And it's these sellers in this little increment here that are now willing to sell their commodity at this higher price, whereas before, at the lower price, they were not. And conversely, if price were to fall from P prime down to P, we would see a reduction in quantity supplied from Q prime down to Q, and that's because these sellers in this little increment right here are now no longer willing to sell their output because price has fallen below their reservation price, below their economic cost of production. Now, for those sellers who are selling their output at a price of P, of producer surplus, which is just the difference between the price that they sell their barrel of oil for and the minimum price that they're willing to accept, the actual cost of production. So for example, this ith seller is receiving a price of P for her barrel of oil. The economic cost to her is only down here, measured by the height of the supply curve. So she receives some sort of a gains from trade equivalent to that vertical distance between the price she receives and the cost she incurs. These sellers as well will also realize some sort of a producer surplus, but it'll be smaller. Not because the price that they receive is any lower, but the costs that they incur are higher. So they just have less or fewer gains that they can extract from the marketplace for any given transaction. Now, if we imagine that along the supply curve there are many sellers, okay, all extracting some sort of surplus from the marketplace, we can kind of add up the surplus for each of these sellers, and what we're going to see is that total producer surplus, which is just, as you can see here, the summation of each seller's surplus, or measured as the area of this blue triangle. And the way that I like to quickly identify what that producer surplus is visually is it's always going to be the area below the price in the marketplace, in this case 20, the area above the supply curve, i.e. the area above every seller's economic cost, and up to the quantity that actually gets supplied, in this case 50. So using that heuristic, we've identified this blue triangle as measuring total producer surplus. And we can calculate the area of this triangle quite simply using the base times height divided by 2 formula for a right triangle. The base of this triangle being 50, the height being 10, so 10 times 50 is 500, divided by 2 is 250. So that's how we get this example, or this answer right here. And that's the measure of the total gains from trade for sellers at a price of 20. As we indicated earlier, when prices rise, we see that quantity supply rises. That's a movement up along the supply curve. But we also know that there are several other variables that actually influence quantity supplied. Now, their influence is not depicted explicitly on the supply curve. We only have 2 variables that we're measuring. Price is on the y-axis, and Q is on the x-axis. But those other variables still play a role. And those changes will be depicted not by a movement along the curve, but by a shift of the curve. A rightward downward shift, which is oftentimes referred to as an increase in supply, using the horizontal perspective. At a given price, along the original supply curve, quantity supply was Q, but now, for whatever reason, that rightward shift allows quantity supply at a price of P to be much, much larger, Q prime. So there's been an increase in quantity supplied, holding prices constant. Conversely, we can view a downward shift in the supply curve, a reduction in the minimum price that sellers are willing to accept. So we see that along the original supply curve, in order to produce that Qth unit, that Qth barrel of oil, for example, sellers were initially willing to accept no less than P. Now the minimum price that they're willing to accept is much lower, P prime. And as you might expect, an upward or leftward shift in the supply curve, which we oftentimes refer to as a decrease in supply, has the opposite interpretation. So, taking that horizontal perspective, where at a price of P, quantity supplied was initially Q, it has since fallen down to Q prime. Or, in order to produce that Qth unit of output, where settlers initially required no less than a price of P, now they're requiring a price of no less than P prime, a much higher price. Okay, so that's how I would interpret an increase and a decrease in supply. With input and input prices, it's important to kind of think about what inputs actually are by definition. Think of an input as anything that goes into the production process. If the prices of inputs rise, all else equal, we can expect that the costs of production to rise, and as a result, the supply curve will shift up and to the left, a decrease in supply. We can expect sellers to require a higher price to produce any particular level of output. Falling input prices, which suggests falling cost of production, will be associated with a downward rightward shift in the supply curve, which just suggests that for any given level of production, settlers are willing to accept a lower price because the costs of production have decreased. Technological improvements, i.e. Improvements to the way that things get made, allow settlers to produce a given level of output with fewer inputs and at lower cost. Conversely, reductions in technology or losses of technology require that producers use more inputs. Visually, we can look at an improvement in technology as ultimately leading to a rightward shift in the supply curve, which we see in this left panel here. Here, at a given level of prices, as technologies improve, sellers are able to sell more, which again we can also view as sellers' willingness to accept has declined for any given level of output because costs have decreased. Lost technology, however, is going to lead to that leftward shift in the supply curve because at any given price, sellers are now able to sell less, or conversely, at any given quantity, sellers now require higher prices to offset the higher cost of production. Okay, current supply can also be impacted by expectations about the future. And here it's important to think of the supply curve as measuring the quantity supplied for a commodity today. The commodity supplied for a commodity today. So, as a seller, if you expect the price that you can receive for selling something to be, let's say, higher in the future, well, that might reduce your willingness to sell a commodity today because you can sell it tomorrow at a higher price. Conversely, if as a seller you're expecting the price that you can sell a commodity for to be lower tomorrow, well, then you may very well increase your quantity supply today so that you can kind of take advantage of prices while they're high. As is maybe obvious to a lot of us, as the number of sellers in the marketplace rises, we're going to see an increase in supply, and conversely, as the number of sellers declines in the marketplace, we can expect to see a decrease in supply. Is this price of related goods? And when talking about how goods are related to one another, at least in the production sense, we have both substitutes and complements in production. Think of substitutes in production as commodities that can be easily produced in exchange for one another. So, corn versus wheat if you're a farmer, or diesel gasoline versus regular unleaded gasoline if you're a refinery. These will be substitutes in production. It doesn't take much to exchange production from one type of commodity and move it over to the other. Complements in production, on the other hand, are commodities that can be viewed as being produced together or in tandem. And it's oftentimes useful to think of complements in production where one commodity is the byproduct of another. So, cattle ranchers, when they produce beef, are also producing leather. Using more economic definitions, we can think of substitutes in production, and we can identify them when a price increase in one, commodity I, for instance, leads to a decrease in the supply of commodity J. And conversely, a decrease in the price of commodity I leads to an increase in the supply of commodity J. We'll do an example shortly. And for complements in production, we can identify two goods as being complements to one another when the price increase of the one, I, leads to an increase in supply of the other. And a price decrease in one leads to a decrease in supply of the other. And just kind of a quick example here of using substitutes, you think of wheat and corn. So if you're a farmer and you have an acre of land, you can pretty easily, within a growing season, substitute corn for wheat or wheat for corn. So wheat and corn might be really good examples of substitutes in production. And focusing on this left panel first, which is the market for wheat, if the price of wheat were to rise from P up to P prime, we can expect the quantity supplied to increase from Q out to Q prime. That's a movement up along the supply curve, because as prices rise, more and more farmers are going to find that the price of wheat falls above or lies above, and we're going to see an increase in the quantity supplied of wheat. Now, if you're going to produce more wheat on that 1 acre of land due to the price increase, that requires that you sacrifice the production of something else that was once being grown on that land. In this example, maybe corn. So here, even though the price of corn did not change, it stays at a price of P, we see that the supply curve for corn shifts inwards from S to S prime. And as a result, holding price is fixed, whereas the quantity supplied was once Q, now it is at a lower quantity, Q prime. Why is that? Because that 1 acre of land that farmers were once using to harvest corn is now being used to harvest wheat. The end.